Hi, this is Early Music Exam 3 review video number 2. So you should have already seen review video number 1. And we are now starting with this video on the question about early 18th century musicians. The question is, in the early 18th century, what did court musicians do that helped them to have a better sense of new musical trends as opposed to church musicians? Well, church musicians were basically in the church. They didn't get much of a chance to travel. They had services to prepare for regular services and then of course the Sunday services. So court musicians had the chance to travel with their employers. In fact, they were expected to travel with their employers. And what that meant is that they had the chance to be exposed to music from other cultures. They got to find out about what the newest trends were. And so that's the difference. There you go. So again, one more time, court musicians had the chance to travel. That's what separated them from church musicians. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Which is true of the Baroque treatment of rhythm? We kind of already covered this. Did I put this question on twice? Maybe I did. Well, basically, there's a very clear sense of overall rhythm and meter in Baroque music. So again, clear sense of overall rhythm and meter. Now, just as an aside, the harpsichord was one instrument that did this really well, and a lot of times you'll hear motoric rhythms. Remember we talked about sewing machine rhythms. We get this steady rhythm in the background oftentimes on the harpsichord that really basically is almost like percussion. It keeps the beat with its crisp sound. And because there was a sense of a grounded meter and a grounded rhythm, a lot of the upper rhythms and the melodies were able to contrast a lot against that. Okay, that brings us to another aspect of rhythm. The next question is, a bass part that moves in even notes, usually eighths or quarters, is called, and that is called a walking bass. Okay, now don't be confused with these terms. We have walking bass, we have basso continuo, we have ground bass, we have basso ostinato. We have all of those, so don't be confused by those terms. When we're talking about a walking bass, we're talking about a bass line that goes in a regular rhythm, and a steady rhythm of usually eighths or quarters. Okay, the next question. Baroque dynamics generally do what within a movement? They generally stay the same, generally speaking. Now, we did talk about terraced dynamics. Now remember, terraced dynamics, that's this idea that dynamics don't do gradual crescendos or decrescendos usually in the Baroque era. That oftentimes they're terraced. Most of the time they're terraced. Just like terraced farming, that means that there are different levels of dynamics. So you might find, for example, forte contrasted with piano. But really, in orchestral pieces or in chamber pieces, you hear this in the contrast of the instruments. So if a soloist plays, of course, that's probably going to be pretty quiet compared to when the whole orchestra comes in, and then we get a complete contrast with a louder dynamic. But the question that you need to prepare for the exam is, in general, the dynamics stay the same per movement. Got it? Awesome. Okay. Next question. Which instrumental family formed the core of the Baroque orchestra? And then I connect this with the next question, which is, what was the orchestra of the court of Louis XIV called? Well, in this era, strings. It's all about strings. So strings form the core instrument of the Baroque orchestra. Now remember, there were two different kinds of orchestras in general. There was a general string orchestra, but also there was a festive orchestra, which included other instruments. Now, I don't think I asked you that question on the test, unless it's on the review sheet. We'll see. But that's interesting to know. Now, the follow-up to that is, what was the name of Louis XIV's orchestra? Well, I'm sure he had a festive orchestra as well, but his string orchestra was known as the 24 Violins of the King. Now, this is the thing. There weren't really 24 violins. So that can be confusing. And we didn't talk about that in class, but it is in your book. Louis XIV's orchestra was known as the 24 Violins of the King, even though there were cellos and violas in that group as well. Okay, the next question is a general one. It is, what is ornamentation? Ornamentation is the practice of improvising melodic extras in the music. Now, some composers wrote out some of these, so it's not necessarily always improvised, but often it's improvised. And especially when we get to the part on the da capo arias, remember da capo means going back to the head or back to the start, and those forms were A, B with a return to A. When we return to A, oftentimes that's when we're going to hear the ornamentation. Other ornamentation will often happen with cadential figures. Again, I'm giving you some extra stuff because, hey, this is about learning about music, not just acing the exam, even though I want you to ace the exam too. Okay, next question. What is the standard texture of much Baroque music? You know this. Think about it, the texture. When we talk about texture, we're talking about monophony, homophony, and polyphony. Well, in the Baroque era, polyphony reaches its peak. Just think of the fugues at the end of, from the Art of Fugue by Bach at the end of his life. That is the culmination of polyphony. Okay, so remember, polyphony is the primary and most important texture of music of the Baroque. And polyphony means multiple lines going on at once. We talked about what lines means last class. Next, in Baroque music, the continuo, or basso continuo, is what part of the music and who usually plays this part? Well, as the title suggests, it involves the bass line, basso continuo. So it involves the bass line, but it's not just the bass line. Basso continuo in the Baroque era also involves chordal instruments, chordal, C-H-O-R-D-A-L. In other words, instruments that can play chords. What they would do is they would improvise those chords above the bass notes. So a typical basso continuo group of instrumentalists will include some instruments that are playing just the bass line, and that would be, for example, the cello or the bassoon. Those are low or bass instruments. But those instruments can't play the chords above, so we'd also have an instrument that can play those chords above. Most typically, that would be the harpsichord. If not the harpsichord, then it could be the lute or the theorbo. And you know I love the theorbo. I want a theorbo. Okay, next. How did Baroque composers view the use of emotion in their compositions? Well, guess what? We kind of already went over this. Basically, they isolated and categorized emotions and worked to convey them as systematically as possible. Right? We went over that, but that's actually, what I just said, remember that. That's the wording that you might see on the exam. Okay, we'll just do a few more. Next is, what is a concerto grosso? Now remember, this is followed by another question. I'm going to actually zip to that one first. The next question is, what does the word concertare mean? Remember, concertare means to contend. So a concerto is about some kind of contention. We've got the orchestra kind of fighting against or in contrast with a soloist or multiple soloists. Now, a concerto grosso means big or large. Basically, a concerto grosso involves a group of soloists that are contending against the orchestra. Now remember, the Brandenburg concertos that we listened to Brandenburg Concerto number 5 by Johann Sebastian Bach. And those Brandenburg concertos are all examples of concerto grossi. Grossi is the plural for grosso. So there are multiple concertos with multiple soloists and different combinations of soloists. Okay, so that's a concerto grosso. Don't be confused. A concerto grosso and a concerto, they're slightly different. Just a regular concerto will have a soloist usually, and a concerto grosso specifically is multiple instruments used as soloists in the Baroque era. Okay, that's it. I'm basically out of time for right now, and so that concludes review video number 2 for exam 3 for early music appreciation. And I will see you soon with video 3.